Do you hear that? How do you broadcast a silence? Well, not just any silence, but the great silence, as it was then called. I know at the time of this podcast's release, Armistice Day has been and gone, but this is our moment-by-moment chronology of what happened when in the early British broadcasting story. And it brings us to the first BBC Armistice, the 11th of November 1923, but previously on the British Broadcasting Century. The British Broadcasting Company is about to turn 1 year old, and it's gone from a series of local stations, beginning in London, Manchester and Birmingham, to a national service reaching 8 stations and often using simultaneous broadcasting technology to send one transmission to all stations. It means that General Manager John Reith, on the cusp of being promoted to Managing Director, is becoming increasingly keen to see the BBC's place in society. Recently, he's invited the Prime Minister and the King to broadcast. Both have declined. But as the 5th anniversary of the end of hostilities approaches, how should the BBC mark this national occasion of mourning? It's the first British Broadcasting Armistice. This time, guiding us through not just this, but other early British Broadcasting Armistice commemorations, we have Professor Rachel Cowgill, cultural historical musicologist, Professor of Music at the University of York. Her article is Canonising Remembrance, Music for Armistice Day at the BBC 1922 to 1927. I found this online, she wrote it 14 years ago, and she generously joined us for a chat about her writing from a decade and a half earlier. But a decade and a half is nothing to us here on the British Broadcasting Century when we go back more than 100 years to see how the BBC began and how the BBC helped sculpt the armistice in our national memory. Also, this episode unearthed in the editing of it one of the earliest recordings of a BBC broadcast. Breaking news as it comes in.
If we have a duty to our dead, we have also a duty to the living.
Stay tuned to this frequency to hear this 1927 recording of this episode. It's all part of this British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London calling.
Hello, welcome to the British Broadcasting Century. I'm Paul Carenza. Thank you as ever for joining us. You are marvels for being here. This is not a BBC production. This is just independent, made by one person, listened to by one person, and that person is you. All right, there are others listening as well. But the joy of the audio medium is it just feels like us, which makes it a very different experience when, for example, you are broadcasting the Armistice. I want you to just think back for a moment to when you've experienced Armistice commemorations via the BBC or other media. How different is it experiencing that, watching it on television? You may see the cenotaph, you may feel a sense of the occasion, and you may feel like you're part of that group who are there, or you may feel distanced from the group who are there. Now, how different does it feel when you hear it on the radio, when they cut out and there's silence? So unusual for radio today, especially. Those big questions of how you deliberately broadcast a silence were being asked at the early BBC. Joining us to tell us all about it, our guest this episode is Professor Rachel Cowgill.
Delighted to welcome to the podcast now a cultural historical musicologist, what a brilliant title that is, Professor of Music at the University of York, Professor Rachel Cowgill. Thank you for joining us, Rachel.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Well, I found your wonderful article online called Canonising Remembrance, Music for Armistice Day at the BBC, 1922 to 1927. Couldn't be more up my street if it tried. So I had to get in touch. So your music by background, and then this came onto your radar, presumably, at least 14 years ago.
Yes, it was part of the general run-up to the commemorations of the Armistice. I'd been doing some work on Elgar, Elgar's A Spirit of England, as a piece that was written very much within the context and the emotional turbulence of the First World War, or the Great War, of course, as it was then. So this kind of developed out of that. I had in mind a series of projects looking at music during the First World War, everyday music, the music that the soldiers knew, the soldiers performed, the touring concert parties. And as part of that, also looking at the compositions that were created as a way of trying to sum up or give some sort of public, focus for the emotions of that time. In a way, the war memorial became such an incredible focus for communities all across the UK and cities, towns, villages. And there were pattern books that, sculptors could use or kind of create the design for memorials and put those out there. And they could be made and they could be bought and they could be installed by communities. So there was a sense of, okay, well, sculpture seemed to be kind of really finding a way of addressing the tone and providing what people needed. So how were other arts involved in that, or how were they responding? So, from a music point of view, that was an intriguing set of questions to start to explore. And then, of course, we all got very much kind of wrapped into the commemorations of the Armistice, and suddenly this kind of became a much broader topic, and everybody was talking about commemoration and Armistice, and where we feel and what we feel about how the events of 1918, 1919, where we are now in terms of our sense of how they resonate forwards through our time as well as the last century.
So it's November 1923. It's the 5th anniversary of the end of the First World War. And of course, so many of those early BBC names had fought in that war. Arthur Burrows, first director of programmes, he spent some time in Belgium before coming back to Marconi House and listening to the German wireless propaganda. His deputy, Cecil Lewis, was a World War I flying ace. And John Reith was in the trenches and got that rather famous gash to his cheek when he stood up, and there was a lot of him to stand up as well. Only weeks earlier, he'd actually gone for a wee in no man's land. Escaped that unscathed, but not the next occasion. So this was a time when the war was not so much history as something that happened very recently. And Britain was working out how to mark the occasion. There was the erection of the cenotaph, the burial of the unknown warrior in 1920. And a year before that, the start of what they then called the Great Silence.
It was a decision made by the War Cabinet in response to the discussions had with Sir Terry Fitzpatrick about practices of commemoration in South Africa during the war. And he said that they developed, I think it was a 3-minute silence that was had within communities, quote, for the living and the dead who had pledged and given themselves for all that we believe in. So that kind of the solemnity of that, and it was clearly felt to be a very powerful way of improvising, I suppose, in the the emergency of war, a sense of creating time and opportunity to focus on the loss. And it was taken up by the War Cabinet, and we kind of know where that's ended up today.
Someone said there was even a record made of classic Armistice silences, which seems very odd that track 1 would be one silence and track 2 would be another silence.
Before we dive in more fully into the British broadcasting Armistice, by chance I was emailed recently by Trace Arso of the Yugoslav Discographic Society, who sent me a self-penned article on the evolution of electrical sound recording. It's written for Antique Phonograph News in Canada, and Trace notes that the earliest example of electrical recording, as opposed to the acoustic method, was by Lionel Guest and Horace Merriman. It was here in Great Britain in 1920. That's actually 5 years before electric recording is generally thought to have begun. Most put the start date at 1925, Western Electric, North America. But yeah, these two British inventors happened to get electrical recording ready for November of 1920. And that was a pretty big Armistice Day, because the cenotaph was unveiled and the unknown soldier was ceremonially buried in Westminster Abbey. Inside the Abbey were microphones. Outside the Abbey, a recording van. Yes, this was the world's first publicly issued electrical recording, the burial of the unknown soldier. The released record featured 2 songs, both of which came quite near the end of the burial service, which was 3 hours long. So you could take to hear at home Abide With Me, and Rudyard Kipling's Recessional. So that record was yours to keep for 7 shillings and 6, available from Westminster Abbey itself, a fundraiser for their restoration fund. So that got the Abbey on board with this recording experiment. So this was just too early then, 1920, for the event to be broadcast as such. But I just wonder, had the government not banned broadcast experiments that year after the Melba concert, maybe the Marconi Company might have bid to be there as well, alongside Guest and Merriman with their own microphones, not going to a recording van, but being broadcast. But that was not to be. As Trace's article notes, this wasn't just the first electrical recording to be publicly released, it was also the first long-distance recording of any kind, given the Abbey and the van and the cables in between. For the first time it showed you could sort of record anywhere. Also, Trace humorously notes that as this record was released for sale in late December 1920, once it had been processed and they'd worked out which songs could actually be just about audible, that means that this record could be called the first Christmas #1. Yeah, Abide With Me, not quite as festive as Bing Crosby, Mariah Carey or Michael Bublé, but hey, it launched an industry. Now, thanks to World War I Recordings' YouTube channel, that's WW1 Recordings, if you'd like to find it. Thanks to them for the sound, and thanks to Trace Arso for the story behind this. The link is in the show notes if you want to read Trace's full article. Some wonderful pictures in there as well. So that's 1920, but as for the broadcasting tale, 11th November 1922, that's 3 days before the BBC begins, but London 2LO is on the air. And at this point, 2LO's broadcasts were often in aid of other certain charities. So in fact, on this occasion, it was a transmission to the Corinium Wireless Society in aid of St Dunstan's Hostel. It was a way of not only raising a bit of money, but also awareness for what broadcasting could be. So on that 4th anniversary of the end of the First World War, you'd have heard Kenneth Ellis, the bass baritone, singing Till I Wake. You'd hear a contralto, Kathleen Williams. You'd hear a cellist, Ida Starkey. And Rudyard Kipling's work, Lest We Forget, was recited by none other than Arthur Burroughs himself. The transmission was concluded with Kenneth Ellis again singing O God, Our Help in Ages Past.
And then in 23, Reith's now in charge and brings with him all this sort of religiosity and things like that. So you've got Reverend Dick Shepherd, who became known as probably the most famous radio reverend in the 20s, with his national call to righteousness, military band music, and then sort of patriotic music, God Save the King, Edward Elgar, a bit of Land of Hope and Glory, I've Got to Help in Ages Past again. And then Reith's own brother, Reverend Archibald Reith, it keeps it in the family, and he gives the sermon, basically, it seems.
Yes, absolutely, yes. One way of kind of keeping a control on what the tone is, I guess, yeah.
You can see Reith's fingerprints over the entire event with that itself, you know.
The Dundee Courier, 10th of October 1923. Another special feature will be the broadcasting from all stations of the speeches made in Trafalgar Square on Armistice Day. This will necessitate the use of special microphones. And at this point, you could hear the Prime Minister broadcast. We told you how John Reith petitioned the Prime Minister, asking if they could transmit his speech. Well, on this occasion, the BBC lined up their microphones, and they did so. Stanley Baldwin spoke to the nation. Also, Viscount Grey of Falladon, the Australian Prime Minister, the Honourable Stanley Bruce, Margaret Bonfield, the first female chair of the TUC Council. So the listings, of course, mention this afternoon schedule. But what of a morning broadcast? There's none mentioned. But the press to the rescue. 12th November 1923 in the London Daily News. Wireless yesterday made the 2-minute silence a real thing to thousands who remained indoors. At 10:55, without the usual preliminary of 2LO speaking, the time signal was broadcast by the BBC, followed by the clear notes of the last post. At 11 o'clock, the hour was sounded on the station bell, and at 11:02, the sharp ringing notes of the Reveille brought the brief observance to an end. 2LO for once closed down without its usual formula. As for the listings, it's 1926 before there is some listing for the morning of Armistice Day.
There's a quite interesting phrase, actually, that I came across in the Radio Times. I mean, it's 1935, so there's quite a lot of time that's passed. But it seems like a very weighty idea. The critic who's writing describes...
Here is one of the great paradoxes, that no broadcast is more impressive than the silence following the last dashing strokes of Big Ben. Its impressiveness is intensified by the fact that the silence is not a dead silence, for Big Ben strikes the hour, and then the bickering of sparrows, the crisp rustle of falling leaves, the creasing of pigeon wings as they take flight, uneasy at the strange hush, contrast with the traffic din of London some minutes before. Naturally, vigilant control of the microphone is essential. Audible distress near to the microphone would create a picture out of perspective as regards the crowd's solemn impassivity and feelings. Our job is to reduce all local noises to the right proportions, so that the silence may be heard for what it really is, a solvent which destroys personality and gives us leave to be great and universal.
A solvent that destroys personality and gives us leave to be great and universal. That's that sense of sort of the erasure of individuality, personality, and, you know, something monolithic and community and beyond community even.
I hadn't realised until we did this podcast how many of the people at the time would listen to radio in village halls and things like that. It could be a communal thing, but obviously you still have that idea. Radio's something you could listen to at home on headphones on your own, but feel part of something bigger.
Traditionally, you know, we get that sort of framing, don't we, of the silence with the last post and the reveil or reveille. We
However
this
pronounce it.
about how to pronounce
that bit.
Yeah. So as people who are familiar with the ceremony today will appreciate just how well that kind of frames the silence.
Now, on the early BBC, of course, they were quite used to closing down for a minute or two or three or an hour or most of the day, in fact. From the early 3-minute intervals the government insisted upon to listen out for planes trying to land and ships trying to dock and SOS messages, to the slightly longer gaps of indeterminate length where they needed to reset the studio or get that orchestra out and get new performers in, or half-hour gaps just because they'd closed down the children's hour and the news wasn't there until 7. Or long, overnight periods of silence on the air, after the Savoy Havana Band maybe had danced the night away and the next day had yet to begin. We are so used now to 24-hour programming and non-stop content that those moments of pause and silence stand out all the more.
And then we kind of get this sort of soundtrack idea coming in. There's this kind of tug between the popular and giving the populace what they want, and yet at the same time marking the solemnity of the moment and its national significance. So you do get composers like Elgar, Paris, Jerusalem, you get John Ireland's setting of Macefield's Sea Fever, things like that. But at the same time, they also are responding to popular taste with numbers from Edward German's Merry England, but also things like, you know, the songs that the soldiers sang on the way to and from the trenches, you know, It's a Long Way to Tipperary. Those kinds of things, admittedly towards the end of the programme, you know, after the weather and the news and the time signal, there's that sense of trying to bring everyone on board with it and to sort of allow space for the popular alongside these more classically orientated symphonic works, cantatas, you know, voice and orchestra, that kind of setup.
And then in 1925, they added the Lord's Prayer and the sounds of the crowds in Trafalgar Square. So that in 1925, before the 2 minutes, you got a sense of the occasion and a sense of those gathering. As Rachel notes in her article, perhaps to heighten the sense of contrast with the stillness that followed.
When crowds are gathering in Trafalgar Square before the ceremony starts, there's that sound and the bird song for a few minutes before the actual ceremony itself. So there's that kind of, that sort of sense of trying to transport those who are listening to the seat of power, to Whitehall, to the hub. Also, I think there's that sense when they're programming the evening performance in the sort of 1924, 1925, there's that sense of what's the emotional trajectory that they want the audiences to go on in the course of this event. There's debate. I mean, Reith is saying, well, don't you think we should have the national anthem? I'm definitely for something religious somewhere in the concert itself. Perhaps you should have something religious at the end. He's really, really wanting Jerusalem in that performance. As it turns out, Jerusalem isn't included. And you get a rather forlorn statement from him on a memo about this, saying, well, could we have it at least at some point in the day? Because Jerusalem is the real spirit. So he's really advocating, but there's no evidence that Jerusalem was actually performed in the course of Armistice Day in 25 at all. So, these are really quite fluid discussions. And the question about whether you should start a concert with, for example, the slow movement of the Eroica and finish with the national anthem, or start with the national anthem and finish with the Eroica. It's all very much kind of under discussion how each piece will contribute to a sort of change of atmosphere and move the emotions of the audience on. So, really fascinating to look at that.
I noticed as well you draw out the jazz question as well, that actually as the 20s goes on, because Reith notoriously hated jazz, and then you've got this question about whether that's appropriate for a day like this?
Absolutely, and that kind of swings to and fro, that debate all the way through the 20s. And you get Armistice jazz. It's literally called Armistice jazz. People who want dance music late evening on Armistice Day, why not? A way of celebrating the fact that we're no longer in those times, and chance for some celebration to come in. There is a particular issue around dancing, of course, but a couple of years later, there is the Savoy Band do come in and do some jazz performance, and the dance band repertoire does make an appearance there. But it's controversial.
I remember reading there was a bit of a debate in the very early BBC when it literally had sort of 4 employees, and Reith was one of them. And Cecil Lewis, the first deputy director of programmes, who actually lied about his age so he could join up, and he was like the youngest of the founding fathers. So he's a flying ace. He'd seen so much horror because he'd been flying over the war. And he'd seen so much stuff that others wanted a bit more things like news and education. And he was like, we just want entertainment. He just wanted fun and joy on the air and not serious things. And I wonder what he would have made of some of these sort of, I think he just wanted just let's have a good time. Now the war's over, let's have that. So there must have been those clashes as to how we should remember and how we should move on. You talk a bit about a world requiem as well.
Yes, so there was all the time a search for a really monumental, British work that would sum up the collective grief and the collective sacrifice. There were kind of little comments in the press, sort of Sir Edward Elgar should be writing as a British requiem, and that the constants of reference to the requiem, of course, is slightly problematic in the sense that talking about the established church, which is Protestant, references to the Latin Mass of the Dead would be quite contradictory in that sense. There's also this sort of rather, again, forlorn comment, well, we can't really use Brahms's German Requiem, can we? So there's some kind of, sense of a lack, and they're looking for a piece that will fit this rather momentous function. The World Requiem by John Foulds was completed in 1921. It's a huge oratorio by an almost unknown composer who is an orchestral cellist. He's had some success with light music. John Foulds writes a colossal work of about 90 minutes, an oratorio for the fallen of all nations. The libretto, the word book for the piece, is drawn together by Maud McCarthy, who is his partner, and she's a violinist, an Irish violinist. So John Foulds and Maud McCarthy together create this incredible, monumental piece for full soprano, alto, tenor, bass, chorus of at least 360 voices, organ, orchestra, a small chorus of boys and youths that were, the trebles and the tenors. Absolutely huge. And the principle behind it was that it would be a summation, a tribute to the memory of the dead, a message of consolation to the bereaved of all countries.
The BBC were wary of it, is that right?
They are wary of it, yeah. So close to the armistice, just as people are coming out of the war, that sense of everybody's sacrifice being acknowledged was hugely controversial. As indeed were some of the doctrinal aspects of the work that included the voices of boys and soldiers. I think there was one particular moment or movement in the work where the tenor solo introduces in the section in Pace, I hear the voice of the dead speaking from before the throne of God. And then there's an introductory passage at that moment from the soprano based on the book of Revelation. And then you hear what were effectively the voices of the dead themselves in the form of a chorus for boy treble and adult male voices a cappella. And those were positioned up in the gallery of the Albert Hall when this work was first performed as part of the first British Legion's Festival of Remembrance, which of course is still very much a feature of how Armistice Day goes today. So this work is performed with the specific personal blessing of Field Marshal Earl Haig. So this work, John Foulds and Maud McCarthy's A World Requiem, is absolutely intertwined with the creation of the Festivals of Remembrance and with the early activities of the British Legion. And yet, doctrinally, it's really, really problematic for the Church of England. So yeah, the idea that you've got these words sung by the souls of the dead themselves, particularly in the sonorities of the English cathedral choir, would have been pretty controversial. And they actually draw attention to it. There's a wonderful detailed program that is printed, and some of them with silk covers, because this is a very distinguished audience that are assembled to hear this piece. And they talk about that particular passage. The program says in the foreword, "Here the dead live again and are made to speak to those who are left behind and to express something of the bliss of a transcendent state. No longer do the singers intercede for those beyond the veil, but the redeemed intercede with the deity for their friends on earth." So there's, this is a secular setting, and yet this is a kind of very strongly spiritual and quite explicitly religious quasi-service.
It's odd to think how, even like today, it does feel like we've got a sense of the secular and the spiritual somewhere between the two. Do you think by the late 20s, does it settle into something more of a rhythm of how we're used to things? Or is it still changing year on year after that?
It's still changing year on year. The BBC continue to resist doing a performance of A World Requiem, and it remains the centre of the British Legion's festivities, the Festival of Remembrance, from 1923 to 1926. But then there is a decision to stop those performances. It's almost like that work has performed its function and it has become problematic, and something else needs to take its place. What people do then latch on to is Elgar's Spirit of England, and particularly the third movement, which is For the Fallen, and a version of that is performed at the Cenotaph.
The focal point was the Cenotaph in London, but this did cause some consternation from the local stations. Should remembrance be more local than national, given that it's our friends and neighbours who we may be remembering?
And when you get the creation of the BBC as a national service in 1927, you've got the sort of responses that come in from the local stations. Manchester and Hull and Newcastle all come in saying, well, we appreciate that there's a real important national moment here, but actually it's more important for our communities to have their local ceremonies in their own graveyards, in their town halls.
That battle for the regional versus the national thing, that was quite intriguing.
And as far as the festivals of remembrance are concerned, for 1927, what actually is done instead is there's a big sponsorship campaign by the Daily Express. The Daily Express invites people to send in suggestions of pieces of music, sketches and things that were popular among the men at the front and the home front. And what's actually done then is basically the Albert Hall is turned over to the old soldiers and they just sing the old songs. The word we'd use is the plebiscite idea that, people kind of vote for what they want to hear and what they want to be performed and things. And there are actually recordings of some of these songs from that performance that were made, again, with the backing of the Daily Express.
So this is a gramophone recording of that Armistice Day National Concert at the Albert Hall. That is a remembrance festival with the British Legion, and it's 1927, and it was broadcast on the BBC. One of the only recordings we can hear of the BBC in the 1920s. Sponsoring the event, the Daily Express newspaper said 10,000 men and women who served overseas gathered to sing the old army songs and hear the Prince of Wales. That's the future Edward VIII, here as recorded and broadcast on the 11th of November 1927.
Today is the 9th anniversary of the Armistice. We celebrated that first memorable Armistice Day with rejoicing. We celebrated it with relief. It was the end of a long period of strain and struggle, a long period of sorrow and of glory, the like of which we pray God we may never endure again.
I think that may be the best quality BBC broadcast speech of the 1920s, isn't it? The prior ones, if you've heard them on the podcast, George V in 1924, not that easy to decipher what he's saying. The transatlantic concerts recorded in America, 1925, 1926, almost inaudible. But now this...
Nobody who was present in any public place during the 2-minute silence this morning, and nobody at this wonderful gathering tonight, can question for a minute that Armistice Day still holds for all of us as deep a meaning as ever. It was once a day of rejoicing. It is now a day of remembrance.
Thanks to the Vintage Sounds YouTube channel for this. A link is in the show notes to their full recording. It's a marvellous thing. They're doing wonderful things to preserve rare audio like this. Here's another recording from the following year's Remembrance Festival, 1928, also released on gramophone record. This time, they're in the presence of King George V and Queen Mary, who were cheered as they entered the Royal Albert Hall. That 1928 recording there is courtesy of the Colonel's YouTube channel. Sadly, the Colonel is no longer with us, but his videos live on his YouTube channel, keeping those recordings alive. And more on a future episode of the podcast about other rare recordings of the 1920s BBC. Although this, of course, was more an outside broadcast that happened to be broadcast and recorded. But still, it counts. Professor Rachel Cowgill.
So it changes tone completely at that moment. And some of that does appear on the BBC as well. They use the opportunity to bring back the Roosters concert party, which was a very well-known concert party that travelled around between the units. And there are some sketches and songs that are heard on Armistice Day across the airwaves, starting off quite late in the evening, but actually then moved forward, as a result of feedback that they received, that how exciting people found this to be able to hear the concert party again. It doesn't settle down. There's discussion about what should and shouldn't be right the way through in these concerts, right the way through the 20s. What is the best set, the most emphatic, the most poignant set? These are my terms, not the ones that appear in the correspondence. Works that are just capable of summing up what those emotions were like on the day of Armistice anniversaries.
Thank you, Professor Rachel Cowgill, for your time and trouble, and indeed a marvellous article canonising remembrance. It's in the show notes if you'd like to read more. And if you'd like to support the podcast, do join us on patreon.com/Paul Carenza. Thank you to those of you who do. You are utter marvels. Without you folks, there's no podcast. Partly because you help fund books. Ones I've bought in the last couple of weeks include Voices Out of the Air, the Royal Christmas Broadcast 1932-1981 by Tom Fleming. He was one of the commentators at the Queen's coronation and I think the first person to play Jesus on BBC television. I also bought the BBC yearbook from 1960 and I got a copy of Val Gielgud's Years of the Locust. He was the head of BBC drama in the late 1920s into the 30s. So that's 3 books in the last week to add to the collection of 100 or so. And that's all thanks to our dear friends of Patreon. So thanks. If you've been chipping in, those are your books. I'm just borrowing them for now. So videos and writings and things await you on Patreon if you so wish to join us there. Next time on the podcast, as we approach the BBC's first anniversary, we're going to look back at early music on the BBC. What sort of songs were they playing? Who was performing them? And our expert, Earl Oakin, musician, comedian, gramophone expert. He's the podcaster behind Earl Oakin's Gramophone Show. It's a wonderful thing if you like old music from that particular vintage. And he joins us next time, a long overdue chat. I've sort of lost the recordings, but I found them again. This podcast is all about lost and found. So looking back over the BBC's first year of music on the British Broadcasting Century. And all that remains to say is... The British Broadcasting Century is a solo-operated podcast presented and produced by Paul Carenza with original music by Will Farmer and nothing to do with today's BBC whatsoever. We do thank the BBC Written Archive Centre and the BBC History Department and all sorts of others there for general help and research in all this. It takes a village, and that includes you, dear listener, so thank you too for being involved. Do email me, paul@paulcarenza.com if you would like to feedback on the show, and do share, rate and review this podcast wherever you found it. Next time, the BBC's first year of music, Earl Oakin, at the other end of this British Broadcasting Century.